Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. NFL Week 15 and the playoff races continue to get ratcheted up. It's the perfect time to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, to go over to FanDuel.com, use the promo code BetTheBoard. Take advantage of your $1,000 risk-free bet, 30-1 enhanced odds on some of the biggest NFL games each weekend, just in time for the holiday season. I am, of course, Todd Furman, joined, as always, by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. How goes it this morning, my friend?
Not too bad. You sound a little under the weather.
I'm probably operating about 65, 70%. Fortunately, I am not in the NFL protocol, so I will be available this weekend should any of these teams need an extra body in the huddle to keep things going. We power on. You know what it's like? Typically, we hit that wall from like week 8 to week 11. I was able to keep the virus at bay until week 15, until it took me down a little bit.
And now you're hitting the end of the season wall. Well, 2 walls.
It's all about gutting through it, man. It's all about gutting through it just in time for the holiday season. So if I sound a little bit off, that's the reason why. But rest assured, our loyal listeners, the content will remain the same. Payne, before we get into some of the games this weekend, just wanted to get your quick take on what we saw unfold on Monday night between the Cardinals and Rams. I think you and I both had reservations about who this Cardinals team was going to be going forward. And lo and behold, with everything in front of them, they stubbed their toe in the national spotlight yet again.
Take nothing away from the Rams, right? They did it shorthanded. There was a little bit of a battle on that game. We said early in the week the Rams took money +3, and then there was another group that laid Rams money line, Arizona money line. And then all of a sudden, well after we finished recording, late afternoon, early evening, the news comes down that Jalen Ramsey's out. And in a pass-first league, especially in this matchup, he's probably worth 1.5. And so we did see sharp money on Arizona at that point. Groups got out ahead, laid the -135, closed as high as -182 on the Cardinals money line. But just listen, that game, again, take nothing away from the Rams. But that's kind of the issues we've had with Arizona. Very hit or miss, a lot of backyard football at times. When it's out of sync, it looks bad. And so you got the version of Kyler Murray that wasn't good. You got a defense with Von Miller and Aaron Donald that were disciplined and didn't allow Kyler Murray out of the pocket as much as he would have liked. And if you look at his splits as a thrower within the pocket versus out of the pocket, they are drastically different. You got the version of Cliff Kingsbury that we thought might be behind him, because we have seen maturation in his play calling and designing and game management, and that all seemed to have improved, and then suddenly it didn't. But that, I think, is the interesting part of the game, because despite all of the issues for Arizona, you still have a situation where they are fully in that game, lose by touchdown. You have Kyler throw an interception inside the 5. You have a Kyler throw an interception inside his own 30. And you take about 14 points off the board. And despite playing horrifically, you cut back one of those situations and you're right in the game. I mean, Arizona did outgain the Rams by about 90 yards. Now, on a per-play basis, the Rams were about 0.6 yards better and about 6% better in net success rate. But again, just Arizona not doing enough to prove that they're this elite team, and now all of a sudden Hopkins down for the rest of the regular season.
Yeah, I mean, it forces everyone else to step up. We did see A.J. Green emerge off the milk carton with over 100 yards receiving. Christian Kirk, of course, the big play. But when you look at an NFL game, oftentimes you can trace the outcome back to 2 to 3 swing plays, and Arizona gets the early field goal. They then get the Rams to go 3 and out. And like you said, Kyler Murray intercepted inside the 5. You have to wonder how much differently that game goes if Arizona punches that football in, goes up 10-0, and suddenly the Rams may not be as likely to stay committed to the ground game, which wasn't overly efficient, but played a big role in creating some balance and, more importantly, keeping Matthew Stafford protected. One thing I will say, Payne, and we see it all the time, the tantalizing talent that's there. We got good Matthew Stafford on Monday night, and it reminds you how dynamic he can be as a quarterback with some of the arm angles, some of his reads, and some of the deep balls he can throw out there.
He was fantastic. He was pinpointing balls while he was getting hit. But I will ask you this question, because we've talked about it a little bit. Arizona, with that performance included, 4th in defensive efficiency. I have been saying for a while that I don't believe that defense is nearly as good as some of their rankings show. And when you start to think about the pieces again, aside from Budda Baker, who's in your secondary that you really love?
Yeah.
Murphy's okay,
Yep.
but when he steps up in class, he gets decimated. The 2 young linebackers that you spent a fortune on in terms of draft capital, one was benched at one point this season. Isaiah Simmons is, look at his PFF grade. It's horrific. And then you have Chandler Jones. You're starting an interior defensive lineman in Jordan Phillips that was like just outcast from both Miami and Buffalo. There are not a lot of pieces here on defense. And Vance Joseph is doing a very good job schematically. But I think that's a unit that we've been calling for regression, and we kind of saw it unfold right in front of our eyes Monday night.
Yeah, and I don't mean this to sound like a hot take because I don't think it's outlandish or anything else. When you look at some of the defenses as far as the top couple of teams in the NFC, I don't think there's any argument to be made right now, Payne, that if you're looking from top to bottom defensively, you'd much rather have the collection of talent for the Dallas Cowboys than the Arizona Cardinals, despite what these season-long efficiency numbers will tell you.
Not even close. And if you're looking at the trending metrics, Dallas has the 3rd best defense in the league right now. So that has been kind of the silent sleeper, and one thing that we mentioned last week when we were looking at the 2 units in the perception of the Cowboys is like everyone thinks this is an offensive team. Well, if you look at how their offense is trending and you look at how their defense is trending, it's actually becoming a defensive team, especially now when you can get the likes of a Lawrence and Gregory back to pair with the young rookie there from from Penn State.
Kind of scary to think about if the Cowboys offense can regain some of the form and swagger we saw early in the year, how difficult an out they could be in the NFC for the likes of course, the Packers, the Bucks, just to name a few. But let's get into the games this weekend. We do have John Sheeran later on in the show. Always great to get his perspective. Hopefully he's not a little bit unhappy with the way we saw a rash of favorites get to the window over the weekend. So we'll pick his brain on these games. But before we do that, let's kick things off tonight, Thursday at SoFi Stadium, where one of the crown jewels of the weekend sees a battle for AFC West supremacy with the Kansas City Chiefs, a modest field goal favorite as they'll head in to SoFi to take on the Chargers. Total in this game, 52.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. When you look at Kansas City last weekend, Payne, a 49-point outburst. It was the second most prolific offensive performance under a Patrick Mahomes-led group. They handed the Raiders the second largest loss of the Super Bowl era. Meanwhile, the Chargers, they got out to a comfortable lead and had to hang on for dear life at the betting window with the Giants' best attempts to sneak in the back door. And when you look at the way these two teams played against one another earlier this season, Justin Herbert, 281 yards passing, 7.5 yards an attempt, a 125 passer rating with 4 touchdowns. Meanwhile, Patrick Mahomes did throw 2 picks in the game. Not sure he should deserve a lion's share of the responsibility for those throws. And when you look at the Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes has been outstanding against divisional opponents, going 19-3. When you bake in a little bit of the revenge, we know the Chiefs will be down Chris Jones on the defensive side. Are you more interested to watch Kansas City's offense against this Chargers defense, Payne, or the strength of the Chargers, their offense against the strength, I guess, so to speak, of Kansas City at this point?
I got to tell you, this game in general is appointment television for me. I haven't been looking forward to a Thursday night game like this one in a very, very long time. And I think there's interesting elements to both sides of the ball. And, start with the Chiefs offense and kind of remember back to when the turnover bug started. It was this week 3 game against the Chargers in Kansas City where, you mentioned the Chargers, they win outright on the road as a dog. But one thing we I think have talked about maybe a couple times, and I don't know if it's been on air with some of the guys I speak with. I can't really remember. But if you actually break that game down and look at the first 3 quarters, the Chiefs outgained the Chargers 330-200. Better than a 1.1 net yard per play advantage and a plus 16% in net success rate over the first 3 quarters. But the turnovers happened, and those were some of the worst ones you'll see where guys are just wide open and deflections happened. The Chargers didn't actually force them. And we kind of talked, I think, a little bit about Mahomes' interceptions. I believe only 3 of them are actually turnover worthy. Now, schematically, the Brandon Staley defense is one that plays a shell and puts a dome over your offense, and that's the kind of defense that's given the Chiefs offense some relative problems this season. But why didn't it happen in week 3, right? Like, it's very bizarre because I think if you like the Chargers, you're saying, hey, this is the kind of defense that have given the Chiefs trouble. Yet in week 3, that exact style, the very first time the Chiefs ever saw a Staley defense with 25-mile-per-hour winds to boot, the Chiefs didn't really have any problems moving the ball at all. So that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. I want to see what this Chargers defense looks like tonight, because I think that's a unit that can really determine the kind of run the Chargers can make this season, right? Like, let's see what that looks like as a fully healthy unit, right? Kenneth Murray kind of slowly working his way back, more snaps last week than the previous 2 games. Both Derwin James and Asante Samuel Jr. got in limited practices. Let's monitor that situation for tonight. I know they're going to both go out there, warm up, see if they can play. But there's guys we speak with that do nothing but watch film, and they suggest the Chargers defense is trending in the right direction, right? More familiarity with Staley's system, some health of some key cogs returning, and visually some better run defense. For me, right, the metrics in the film are great, and I think this podcast has probably pushed some handicappers to talk about EPA and efficiency and matchups more, right, and less of kind of like the bullshit analysis of ticket counts and bet percentages and narrative. But I think it's important when you are looking at EPA metrics to include some level of context, right? And so, yes, the Chargers run defense the last 2 weeks, 8th best in the league in EPA. And no doubt you had the Chargers defense kind of fly around early in the Cincinnati game. They responded after being called out a little bit. But the Bengals were down 2 starting offensive linemen in that game, and the Chargers got up 24-0. Like, how effective is an opposing run game going to be in that scenario, right? The Giants were trailing 24-7 at the break. You don't just fire up the run game at that point. So I do think there is some noise in the improvements defensively for the Chargers run game. And we saw the Chiefs have some success running it in that week 3 matchup. Now, when I look at trending metrics since the bye, the Chargers are 19th in EPA per play allowed, 22nd in success rate allowed. The first 7 weeks pre-bye, the Chargers were 19th in EPA per play allowed, 29th in success rate. So my gut says, yes, some incremental improvement has kind of taken shape with the Chargers defense, and when Derwin and Asante return, that's massive. But I'm kind of just struggling with the Chargers right now. I mean, let's kind of put a magnifier on what's transpired, semi-recently, right? Like, you can't forget the drubbing Baltimore put on the Chargers pre-bye. And then the Chargers come out of the bye, they lose to the Patriots. Nothing wrong with that, although the scoreboard closer than reality with that late touchdown, which we were all happy about because I think we went over in that game, Todd. And then
that game was more of a sweat than it ever should have been. That's for damn sure.
Yes, there was some rare stuff transpiring in the red zone early and in the green zone. It took Justin Herbert going 32 for 38 to kick a game-winning field goal to beat Philly. You lose to the Vikings. You hold on for dear life against Pittsburgh, but gave up 37 to a Steelers team that had a quarterback cleared to play, I believe, Saturday at midnight. Big Ben had to hop on a private plane at 2 a.m. to fly across the country for a Sunday game. Denver embarrasses you. And then the Chargers beat Cincinnati, a projected 6.5 win team before the season, and then you beat the Mike Glennon-led Giants. I'm having a real tough time with the Chargers in general.
When you look at the Chargers offensively, we know life without Rashawn Slater won't be easy tonight against the Kansas City Chiefs, although they are given a little bit of a lifeline. No Chris Jones, who leads the Chiefs in sacks with 7. He would be unavailable as well. Justin Herbert put his 12th career game of 3+ passing touchdowns on the books last week, second most by a player in their first 2 seasons in NFL history. Only Dan Marino had more impressive company to keep. And when you look at where Justin Herbert is with 8,158 passing yards through 28 starts, puts him second all time behind the quarterback he'll encounter tonight in Patrick Mahomes. But this is a Chargers offense who you talked about, Derwin James and Asante Samuel going to go through warmups. Austin Eckler, it seems they're a lot more optimistic, but haven't said he's going to be fully 100%. They do get Keenan Allen back from the reserve list. But if you're the Chargers and you're trying to craft a game plan to go after a Chiefs Chiefs defense that's playing with a ton of confidence. Is there a vulnerability that teams haven't been able to exploit in this recent run where the Chiefs have now held 3 straight opponents to 10 points or less for the first time since 1997? They have 16 takeaways during this win streak. Yards per play on defense have improved from 6.6 to 5.1, and they're creating the 5th best pressure rate during that span as well.
Yeah, you always want to attack the attacker, and that's one thing Spags has. He plays an aggressive style of defense, and you're going to have a decent time potentially beating that kind of defense when you have Justin Herbert. I mean, the guy is a clear-cut franchise quarterback. He gives you a chance every week. And the part of the team we have supporting evidence of improvement is actually the offense. And, you know, people will still kind of think to our podcast when they see a play where Justin Herbert's bailing out the offense on 3rd and a mile before the half against the Giants last week on a ridiculous throw to Guyton. But the improvement on early downs from the Chargers offense has been awesome. It's taken them to another level. They're being a little bit more aggressive on early downs, something we called for during the bye week, and Brandon Staley said he would evaluate it. And if you look at the Chargers offense pre-bye week, 25th in EPA per play on 1st and 2nd down the first 3 quarters. Post-bye week, Chargers offense 3rd in EPA per play on 1st and 2nd down the first 3 quarters. That is massive improvement. It's real improvement. And while it's not anything like major, the schedule of defenses the Chargers faced pre-bye when they were struggling on early downs had about an average efficiency rank defensively of 19th. Post-bye, with the early down improvement, Chargers have faced defenses with about an average efficiency rank of 17th. So slightly better. And so that's how you can gauge the real improvement past just kind of some of the numbers there. Now, you mentioned there's some key cogs missing on this side of the matchup. You have starting left tackle Rashawn Slater is out. Austin Eckler, game-time decision, but I think he is ultimately going to play, and I believe Staley alluded to the fact that if the Giants game was a little bit closer, he could have returned there. You mentioned Chris Jones, the best Chiefs defender, is out. You have starting linebacker Willie Gay out. L'Jarius Sneed is also out again due to the passing of his brother. So you look at who's left, and it's Frank Clark, who has been on fire recently. He is going to have to take advantage of Rashawn Slater's backup. I think the initial belief is Trey Pipkins at left tackle for the Chargers will replace Slater. Clark's coming on strong, right? Like 8 pressures last week. And then you have Melvin Ingram against his old team who didn't want to pay him. And he is going against right tackle Storm Norton, who's given up 47 pressures this season. So those 2 guys have to be a force with Chris Jones down. But I think, you know, aside from the meaning and the importance of this game within the division and the conference, really, why this side of the matchup to me is really fun to watch is because you have both units that are drastically different now than when they first met in week 3. And I obviously mentioned the early down improvement for the Chargers offense, and you hit on part of the Chiefs' defensive improvement. But when you kind of trend back towards average, which is what the Chiefs have done, to get back to average for the season from where you started, the Chiefs have to play at this ridiculously high level since then. And in kind of the breakdown here is the first 5 weeks, the Chiefs were 31st in defensive efficiency, 32nd in EPA per play allowed, 54% of plays grade successful. Since week 6, Chiefs are 3rd in defensive efficiency, 5th in EPA per play allowed, and they've had about a 12% improvement in down-to-down success rate allowed. Up until this week, though, right, the defense was healthy. Players obviously have been improved. Spags got players in better positions. He's called better games. But this is the real test, right? Like, far and away, the best offense the Chiefs have faced during this, you know, resurgence from week 6. This is going to be telling. And when you start to look at this line a little bit, we had the initial bye from some of the numbers guys laying 3 with KC, and then Rashawn Slater went down, so we got out to as high as 4. Then a group came in and took the 4 in the Chargers ahead of the Chris Jones news becoming public. The one thing that seems to have some level of consensus is the over. The problem, if you're attempting to chase that now, is you could have went over 49.5, and we've blown through the key of 51 and some other meaningful numbers like 50 and 52, and we're out to 52.5 as we record this, Todd.
Yeah, it's always interesting to kind of see that battle and wonder when things have bottomed out. Last week, Kansas City's defense didn't disappoint. They still went over the total with an offensive explosion, aided largely by Raiders' generosity. And one last thing, Payne, you talked about Trey Pipkins filling in. Charger fans may want to cover their ears because him filling in last year, or he's made 8 starts, 4 of which came at left tackle. In those games, he's allowed 15 pressures, 6 quarterback hits, and 4 sacks. Not exactly what you would get from a stalwart rookie in Rashawn Slater if he was healthy and available. But this game, no doubt, will go a long way, not only in defining the pecking order in the AFC West, but also maybe the number 1 overall seed in the AFC playoff picture. And if that game doesn't go far enough, what we'll see Saturday night from Lucas Oil Stadium will definitely help us recreate some perception as far as what we're seeing in this conference. And that, of course, is a game featuring the Colts and the New England Patriots. It's the Indianapolis Colts, a 2.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on this game is at 45.5. Both teams come into this contest off a bye, and it's almost as simple as saying it's the unstoppable force versus the immovable object. Jonathan Taylor, 16 rushing touchdown, leads the league. Pat, 6 rushing touchdowns allowed, which is both league best. The Colts offense over their last 5 games, 34-plus points per game, the most in the league. The Pats, they're allowing a shade more than 7 points per game, best in the league during their recent winning streak as well. Pretty fascinating matchup for a variety of reasons. We know how dynamic Bill Belichick has been as an underdog. But Payne, I'll go as far as saying I don't think Belichick has the same edge with 2 weeks to prepare against his coach that can be as talented and as outside-the-box thinker as Frank Reich is capable if he gets out of his comfort zone for a full 60 minutes.
I agree. And one thing I know is Chris Ballard and Frank Reich are interlocked, right? They are on the same page. They ignore outside noise, and I think they have an understanding of what they want to do offensively, and just because the media thinks you should run it 38 times a game with Jonathan Taylor doesn't mean that's the most efficient avenue. There's to me, still this stench on Carson Wentz from the outside due to his Eagles days and how the first 4 weeks started in Indianapolis. But if you really look at the Colts offense, starting in week 5, once the offensive line injuries improved, the health of Carson Wentz improved, the chemistry of the offense came together after like key cogs missed all of fall camp, things have changed, right? Wentz is 7th in EPA per play since week 5, over 8.1 air yards per attempt since week 9. It's the number 1 offense in EPA per play. Now, Wentz does need to clean up some of the mental issues, and he could improve his accuracy some. But Frank Reich realizes he's not a liability, right? And the offense is really suited to throw. And Reich and the organization realized that building leads is very helpful, right? You just kind of look at teams that have success are teams that build leads, like they get out. So I can see a similar game plan here, even though everyone's thinking, Jonathan Taylor, where Indy comes out and attacks this Patriots defense similar to how they attacked Tampa Bay, right? Like Indy built a double-digit lead against Tampa by being aggressive, more than a 2-to-1 pass-to-run ratio in the first half against the Bucs. And Carson Wentz delivered in spades, right? He went 7.2 an attempt, 56% passing success rate with 3 touchdowns. And then when you can pass, you open up lighter boxes for Jonathan Taylor and you make his job a little bit easier, and the run game's far more efficient. And if you look into some of the passing offenses the Pats have played, they're about 19th on average in passing efficiency. The passing offenses that were 15th or better averaged 24 points against the Patriots. And 2 of those offenses the Patriots played were Tampa and Buffalo in horrific weather. The Colts, their offenses faced 7 defenses in the top 13. They're averaging 31 points per game in those matchups, right? You certainly have to consider what Belichick having 2 weeks to prepare means, but I think the Colts are going to have some success here. And what's interesting to me, and I know we still have the other side of the ball to cover, but just kind of as I'm looking at the Don Best screen here and thinking about this game a little bit and seeing things, like the average total in the NFL this season is a shade over 47 points. The perception of Belichick's defense, right? The models that just factor in EPA and success and score without manually adjusting to incorporate New England having weather games against Tampa and Buffalo, or the Colts having weather games against San Francisco and Buffalo, or not like stripping a 3-pass attempt game completely from the model and just kind of relying on those numbers and not making like these manual tweaks. Like, that can't happen, right? But once you do make those manual tweaks, you realize, like, this is a game with 2 top 10 offenses that might actually be better, and 2 overrated defenses that are currently 2nd and 9th. And kind of when you factor in all that stuff and the total opens at 44, 3 points below the NFL average total this season, like, you can see why pro bettors went over 44 here very early, and we're out to 46 now.
Yeah, definitely a little bit of a market correction there for a lot of the factors that you mentioned, and that's even before we get into the other side of the ball and try and figure out how much more dynamic the Patriots can be offensively if Mac Jones elects to throw the football 3+ times in this particular game. When you look at Mac's numbers since week 7, he's been a game manager and doing it exceptionally well. A shade under 1,400 yards passing, 9 touchdowns to 2 picks, 8.1 yards per attempt, and completing nearly 70% of his passes. We know New England ran the ball 46 times for 220-plus yards against Buffalo. Damian Harris still dealing with a bit of a hamstring injury, which may limit some of the backfield depth. But at the same time, when you look at this Indianapolis defense, Payne, we know who the leaders are. Darius Leonard is a tackling machine out there. Bobby Okereke has really stepped up and provided a nice running mate in that linebacking core. But in the secondary, there are some opportunities for New England if they can get the ground game going and get some of those linebackers to suck up into play action. The Patriots may be able to find some big plays in their own right.
Yeah, it's very possible, and I'm just so happy that this is a standalone game that I can dedicate 100% of my attention to, because I think this is going to tell us a lot, right? Being able to gather more information on 2 teams that, in my mind, both have the parts to win the AFC and make a Super Bowl run. I truly believe that, especially when you start to kind of think of matchups, and kind of going back to where I ended. The fun part about this is, like, the narrative for the last 2 weeks doesn't necessarily match reality. And I'm hearing things like, Belichick doesn't trust Mac Jones. That's why he only threw it 3 times. And then you had Bobby Okereke, and by the way, I'm a stickler for names. Everyone knows that. I love pegging names perfectly. Apparently, he's gone back to his heritage, and he wants it.
Okereke, right?
Okereke, yes.
Yeah, that's my fault, my oversight, so I appreciate the correction
No.
there. We want to be culturally sensitive around these parts.
Everyone knows we're sticklers for names. Spencer Bennett, Stetson Bennett, same thing. So he comes out this week, and there's a question mark if he's even able to play. He's battling with an injury here, but on Tuesday, he comes out and decides to be like, hey, we're going to attack the run game and make Mac Jones beat us. Like, just bulletin board material. I don't understand it. Certainly, you want to stop the Patriots' run game, but the Mac Jones slander just feels so out of touch. And you had some great nuggets there, and, we don't share notes, but I kind of went back to week 5. And since that time, Mac Jones is the second best quarterback in a metric where we merge EPA per dropback and completion percentage above expectation. And Mac Jones has done that against the 3rd most difficult schedule of pass defenses, okay? Unless the ground game is just on fire for New England, I would expect a game plan that revolves around Mac Jones throwing some, especially against a pass funnel defense like Indianapolis. On the season, if you're just looking at this, the Colts top 5 in defensive rush efficiency, below average against the pass. Now, what I've seen recently is the Colts have had some trouble stopping the run, and it makes sense, right? Buckner has been banged up. Darius Leonard, banged up. So the core of the middle of the defense. If you look at the last 4 games, the Colts are dead last in EPA per rush allowed, and by a long mile, over 57% of runs against the Colts the last 4 games have grade successful. No other team is allowing 49% of runs to grade successful over this stretch. So something to consider a little bit there. Is it health? Yes. Is it a little bit of an anomaly? Yes. Now we've watched the Patriots bully teams on this side of the trench all season. So the Colts kind of, you got to get back to form there where they were early in the season against the run. But kind of getting back to Mac Jones, I think if he's on time and accurate, this is a Colts defense that's kind of willing to give up some underneath stuff through the air. The Patriots certainly are not as explosive as like the Rams or the Buccaneers, and they don't have the receiving options. But the Rams and Tampa are the only two offenses inside the top 10 that the Colts have faced. So you would think, right, New England, top 10 offense with 2 weeks to prepare. That'll be the third. Buccaneers scored 38. Rams went for 8.7 per pass attempt and a 58% passing success rate. In the biggest game of the season for Indy, right? Like the Colts defense has to get back in form and handle another step up in class, which they really have not done the first two times. But that they're going to be vital to this matchup in my mind.
There's no doubt the offense will have to carry a lot of the responsibility and weight. And to your point, if they're able to build a lead, it makes the defense's job that much easier. Some breaking news before we get into a couple of other games. Not exactly what your beloved Dolphins want to see. They will be most likely without their top rookie wide receiver this weekend, who has entered the protocol along with some of the other skill position players. So we're seeing a little movement on the New York Jets, and the under is Jalen Waddle officially in the NFL protocol this weekend.
Not the best news. And the Dolphins were very sharp this week. I believe saw a couple guys get out, lay the 8.5. Prior to the news you just broke, we were trending towards even 11. And Waddle is obviously a very huge part of the Dolphins offense, especially with Tua, right? That chemistry, that vibe, that quick short pass game, and allowing Waddle to run after the catches has certainly been a huge part of the Dolphins' resurgence over their win streak.
Speaking of NFL news, we haven't even talked about one of the biggest storylines, and I don't want to go on a tangent here, but for those folks who wanted to get our take on the lovely situation that unfolded in the wee hours of the morning last night in Jacksonville, they'll have to hang out and wait a little while. Curious to get your take on Urban Meyer and the experiment that failed miserably for Shad Khan in Urban's first season in Jacksonville. But let's talk about meaningful football before we get to that. And we have a big game taking place at Heinz Field, where it's the Titans entering on Sunday as a 1-point road favorite against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Total in this game, Payne, sits at 42.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. When you look at the Steelers, they knocked off the Titans 27-24 in Nashville last year. The numbers, they're pretty fascinating. The Steelers as a home underdog, well, they've been dynamic. 2-0 straight up this season in that role, 6-0 against the spread since the start of 2018. Mike Tomlin in his career catching points at home, 12-3-2 against the number. And Big Ben as a home dog, 9-2 straight up, 9-2 against the spread. You talked about how Pittsburgh had struggled going into a short week against the Minnesota Vikings. The exact opposite holds true with extended rest. The Steelers 14-1 straight up over the last 5 seasons, 37-10 straight up going all the way back to 2000. When you look at Tennessee, this is a team still, we know, without its offensive playmakers. Sure, Julio Jones got thrown back into the fold, a modest 4-catch for 33-yard performance, but it was all about their defensive effort pitching the shutout against the Jacksonville Jaguars. When you look at Tennessee offensively, we know the Steelers' defense has struggled, and that probably isn't a strong enough word. Does Tennessee have enough in the way of playmakers to put some stress and strain on a Steelers' run defense that's been extremely vulnerable?
So, listen, I understand the importance of this game in the AFC landscape. It's meaningful because of that. But we're talking about two very overvalued teams. The Titans probably more so than the Steelers, since, pro bettors tipped their hand very early on this season with their thoughts about the Steelers, okay? But right now, these are two teams that are below average in their current state. Titans, we have 1 point worse than an average team. Steelers are 3.5 points worse than an average team in our power ratings. But you are gravitating towards the right number here when you factor in a little bit of a must-win for the Steelers, a little bit of extra time to prepare, and then home field. We made this game pick, so it doesn't shock me that earlier this morning before we started recording, Steelers plus 2.5 got hit a little bit. What makes this matchup just like shoot yourself in the face, and this is how, I don't gain a lot of followers by offending two fan bases simultaneously.
Don't worry, there aren't that many Titans fans out there. You're good.
Both teams are just like extremely vanilla. And, specific to the Titans offense going up against the Steelers defense, right, there's a lot of variance here, right? Both units are clearly struggling a little bit, right? Like, which one possibly finds something close to its old form? Since Derrick Henry and A.J. Brown went down and Julio's been in and out of the lineup, we're seeing a Titans offense that doesn't look very good when Ryan Tannehill has to carry it, and is obviously, people are starting to see why Ryan Tannehill potentially was not a franchise quarterback in Miami, because when he has to shoulder the entire load, like, he just can't. And since week 9, Tannehill's 21st in EPA per play plus completion percentage above expectation. Over that same stretch, the Titans are 23rd in EPA per play offense. Now, it's possible Tennessee can come out here and enforce their will on first down and get ahead of the chains. Steelers are 31st in defensive efficiency on first down. And even though the Titans are pretty predictable on early downs, even, with Derrick Henry out, Titans are still an above average offense on first down. And you're kind of thinking to yourself, in this like grinder type game with a spread of 1.5 or 1, or pick kind of where we're at now, in a total of, in the low 40s here at 42.5, like, being a team that wins on first down can really go a long ways. And maybe that's the case, right? And then you think about the other side and why this is potentially moving a little bit. And it's like the idea of Big Ben having added rest with what feels like the Steelers season hanging in the balance, makes some sense, right? And I think Pittsburgh was one of the better teaser legs this week, and we saw some pro bettors gravitate towards a teaser early in the week, which is something they typically don't do, but that's what's transpired here. Just kind of quickly hitting this, right? Like, the key for Pittsburgh on offense is the O-line, right? We know Big Ben wants to get rid of it quick, but the Steelers are 30th in pass block win rate, and the Titans are one of the best teams in the league getting pressure without sending blitz. Bud Dupree is back. What timing? So he's probably going to play a factor here. The Titans defense has actually stepped up in the absence of all of its offensive pieces missing, right? Since the Colts game, Titans are 5th in EPA per play allowed. And I do think Vrabel is able to come up with something a little bit schematically here. Now, let's not call the Titans defense back, because it's not. And you look at who they've faced over this stretch of solid play, and it's like the Rams at the very bottom of their offensive identity, I would say, and certainly banged up. And it's Trevor Siemian, and it's Tyrod, and it's Trevor Lawrence, all in that sample. But as a whole, the Steelers' offense isn't anything to write home about. It's a below average offense efficiency-wise. You look at what Pittsburgh's offense is going to do. Again, it's very basic. It's very vanilla. They can only do so many things with Big Ben, so you try to establish a ground game with a very poor O-line. Some weeks, you hit it out of the park, right? Where you just shockingly are able to find success over a quarter against a Baltimore run defense that just for no rhyme or reason happens. And occasionally you'll find some success when you're going against poor run defenses. That isn't necessarily the Titans. So it's just this very straightforward vanilla offense against a defense that, again, doesn't have the best parts, but schematically, Vrabel's going to come up with some things here or there. For me right now at pick, I think that's kind of the perfect price. And again, shop around, right? If you're still kind of dealing with some lagging books, probably Pittsburgh in a teaser, if your book is dealing 1.5 or better, right, is probably a decent thing to have in your back pocket in a game like this with a low total and so much on the line. And it looks like they're also going to get some key cogs back from the injury front, potentially some guys along the O-line. We'll keep an eye peeled on Hayden. You're going to get some, potentially a linebacker back as well. So there are some parts returning for Pittsburgh in a very, very vital game for their season.
When you look at the Titans, Payne, assuming that A.J. Brown and Derrick Henry will both be back in the mix when the Titans start playing meaningful football games again in the postseason, do they have the capabilities to be a little bit of a dark horse in the AFC, or do you still think they have limitations that keep them a substantial cut below the likes of the Colts, the New England Patriots, the Kansas City Chiefs, etc.?
It's a good question. I'm not quite sure where those injuries stand right now. And so those are big ifs for me. And God forbid there's a situation where the Titans stub their toe down the stretch. Is it a foregone conclusion that they're absolutely in the playoffs? You lose this game here and you got still some work to do down the stretch. I don't know. I don't really like how this team is constructed in the first place. And now there's obviously some situations where they've, you can get the defense playing at the level it's currently playing at, and all of a sudden the offense returns to its shape and form when healthy. But I just, A.J. Brown's been in and out of the lineup for 2 years now. can you really rely on Julio Jones?
No, you can't rely on Julio.
So,
Julio is a bona fide
right.
number 2, maybe a number 3 in most offenses that have actual talent.
And it's like, even offensively, when Derrick Henry returns, like, it's just a lot of inefficient runs on first and second down. It's really, Derrick Henry becomes this byproduct of, like, wearing you down and kicking it into gear later in games. So it's like they don't do the things that are, like, overly efficient either, like early downs. Like, I don't know. It's a very difficult team for me to gauge. And ultimately, right now, right, the Titans are one of the most overvalued teams in the NFL, in my opinion. Now, if those guys return, certainly it's going to be a boost to the team. But I just, I don't really know here. I'm not a big Titans guy. I think people know that at this point.
It's a fair assessment. It's one of those things that's fascinating because you do wonder if Derrick Henry does come back, how quickly he's able to get up to full speed. And while the workload won't be there, you wonder about him being fresh in the battering rank. If they could try and run him 35 to 40 times instead of 25 to 30 against beleaguered defenses. So a fascinating team, but to your point, definitely overvalued week in, week out. And we'll see if the Steelers can benefit from a few extra days of preparation in the wake of their near comeback victory against the Minnesota Vikings. Two fascinating teams for maybe some of the wrong reasons in the AFC, fighting for the bottom half of that playoff picture. The Bengals and Broncos will do battle Sunday afternoon in the Mile High City. It's Denver, a 2.5-point favorite. Lay $1.20 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total of 44 as they'll welcome in the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals now a robust 0-24 pain when trailing after the third quarter under Zach Taylor's leadership. Only the Panthers have a worse record over that same span, going 0-27. A lot of their wounds last weekend were all self-inflicted with miscues and poor decision-making. When you read and listen to some of Zach Taylor's comments in the wake of that game, said he was disappointed that they elected to kick field goals on multiple fourth and shorts, but maybe even more so, taking the ball out of Joe Burrow's hands in overtime when you have a second and third and short. But alas, here we are. And one of the big reasons I think we've seen money come in on the Denver Broncos so far this week has to do with the Cincinnati Bengals injuries. I mean, you shot me a note yesterday and said, man, this Bengals team is banged up. I didn't quite realize how banged up they were until I dug into the game. It's a who's who of players that missed practice on Wednesday for them.
It was. And, mind you, it is just Wednesday. We'll have a little clearer picture as those injury reports get released here in a couple hours on Thursday. But, obviously, like, massive game for both. And Zach Taylor can say whatever he wants to say after the fact, right? Like, you have to, in the moment, not pee down your leg. And you have to be prepared for those moments, right? In your mind as a coach, you have to be a guy that says, hey, we're going to go for these on fourth and short because we know this is what makes the most sense. Joe Burrow surprisingly played very well last week. Now, I know San Francisco's secondary isn't anything to write home about, but there were some question marks and concerns with the obvious finger injury, and his completion percentage was 5% over expectation last week. So I thought you could have fully trusted Joe Burrow, especially late, to put the ball in his hands. Now, getting to this game specifically, like it's massive, right? There's huge playoff implications. I think this is the highest leverage game of Week 15 in terms of net percentage to make the playoffs with the end result of this game, right? The swings are ginormous, right? We've had drastic line movement from the look-ahead line. A full 6 points. Bengals were -3 last week. A lot of places now out to +3. And I think, part of that movement is health-related, as you mentioned. Part of it is situation. And obviously part of it is a group that came in and laid Denver -1.5, 2 in on the money line. You think about this, like the Bengals exerted a ton of energy playing catch-up against the Chargers, right? Got down 24-0, battled their way all the way back, got within one score. They're in plus territory, and then Joe Mixon, throws up on himself and fumbles, and it's returned for a touchdown. The game's basically over. But a lot of energy exerted to come back. Then you play 5 quarters against San Francisco. Now you're traveling to Mile High with altitude. So that is part of this movement as well. And getting to the health, Bengals have 2 starting offensive linemen dealing with an illness. You have starting right tackle Riley Reif doubtful for this game with an ankle injury, and his backup also came down with the bug. So we will have to monitor that situation along the Bengals offensive line. It's already an O-line that, has some question marks to it. Obviously, have performed above expectation as run blockers, but still stink as pass protectors. we've also seen over the last month or so the Broncos front seven defensively get a little bit healthier with Chubb and Purcell returning, and all signs are pointing to Bryce Callahan being back, one of the league's very best slot corners, which is something huge in a game when you're going against the Bengals receiving core, right? What is interesting, and, to me, though I think we kind of warned people here, right, when the Bengals started 5-2 and Zach Taylor's getting mentioned for Coach of the Year. And I'm sitting there watching Cincinnati and thinking, like, boy, thank God they have talent because the offense stinks. And, you kind of watch the play design and the play calling and the situational stuff that after the fact Zach Taylor is kicking himself for, right? We're in week 14, but gonna get that figured out in like year 3. There's also like very little disguising of things, right? Like they run from certain sets, they pass from certain sets. There's not a ton of disguise going on with this offense. And what I am seeing now is, now that defenses have film and are catching on, since week 8, the Bengals are 21st in EPA per play. On the season, 21st in offensive efficiency, right? And the stunner here, the Bengals have played the very easiest schedule of defenses in the NFL, and by a pretty good margin. And so, the perception is like Joe Burrow, number 1 pick, and like Jamar Chase, and we got 3 great weapons, and we got a very good running back, and the O-line's playing better than expectation. Still, it's a below-average offense because Zach Taylor's running it. And so, like, it makes them very difficult to gauge. And, I think specific to this matchup, you kind of have to look at, are the Bengals able to protect Burrow, right? Since he's O-line 31st in pass block win rate. And now you have these illness and injury concerns to that unit, and you're going up against a Broncos defense that's 11th in pressure rate, and Bradley Chubb has been out for a good part of that sample, right? Burrow hasn't been the best under pressure either. Completion percentage, less than 56%. 9 turnover-worthy throws when pressured. Now, if Cincy can protect Burrow, right, there could be some opportunities here, Todd, through the air, the way Fangio likes to play some of his corners in off coverage.
Going to be interesting. When you talk about some of the offensive line concerns for the Bengals, no doubt the illness, even if the players are upgraded heading into the weekend, if Joe Mixon's performance last weekend was any indication, he had one of his lowest snap shares of the entire season. Only out there for 59% of the reps, and we know he missed practice on Wednesday and Thursday, so you wonder at 65, 70%. Is that enough given the wear and tear they've gone through over the last couple of weeks? Meanwhile, on the other side of the ball, Logan Wilson expected to miss again for the Bengals. We know that was a big problem as George Kittle continued to feast. I won't put Noah Fant on that same level, but you think the Broncos could utilize their tight end and take advantage of the middle of the field. The Broncos, well, Payne, their template has been relatively straightforward during this recent run of success. They win when Teddy Bridgewater throws the ball less than 30 times in a football game, mainly because it means more touches for Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. I mean, Williams continues to take on a bigger workload, paying dividends. You look at this tandem of backs, 39 carries, 184 yards, and 3 scores between them on the ground. Last week against the Lions are the only teammates now in the NFL to each have 150-plus carries. The injury bug, though, hasn't just plagued the Bengals offensively. They could be down a couple of guys defensively or not at 100% as well.
Yeah. This is really interesting if you're following this game, right? You're going to definitely have to just keep checking the injury reports leading up to this game. Now, you mentioned the Denver offense being a little bit more efficient when they do run it, and the offense has been very solid, right, the last couple of weeks, and it's primarily because both their starting tackles returned. Like Bowles and Massey have been huge, right? Getting 2 starting offensive tackles back, premium position guys, like, it's just huge. Javonte Williams is special. Melvin Gordon came into this season in better shape, and obviously he's being pushed. His job is in jeopardy, right? So, like, everything seems to be working at its core, right? Denver wants to run it. They're 50% run on early downs. And then you just kind of look at the last 2 weeks, and again, it's a very small sample, only 2 data points, but with the tackles back, the Broncos are 4th in EPA per rush over that 2-game stretch. I don't see Denver abandoning that, but the way in my mind to attack Cincinnati is through the air, especially on early downs. Like I'd love to see Pat Shurmur change up tendencies, throw on early downs, because it's obviously good to change tendency, and the Bengals are a top 10 in defensive rush efficiency on first and second down, but 28th against the pass on first down. And Zach Taylor came out and said he believes that his lead corner, Chidobe Awuzie, can play through the foot injury. We will see. Very difficult as a corner mirroring receivers cutting to have a foot injury. So I think at some level that is going to have an impact, whether he's out there playing at less than 100% or not out there. Obviously, that would be a substantial loss. He's been playing out of his mind, probably better than projections, and he's been playing at a peak level. So that would be pretty significant. This doesn't feel like a game where Teddy's going to be under much pressure. I think that's even more of a reason to throw in early downs and break that tendency. Cincinnati, 28th in pass rush win rate. They don't do a ton to manufacture pressure either. The Bengals blitz at the 6th lowest rate in the league. Zach Taylor claims he's optimistic about Trey Hendrickson playing. So that's a positive for Cincy. As a whole, the Bengals defense has clearly improved year over year. And it should, right? Like, lots of money was spent along the D-line in the secondary. But, it's an above-average unit that's played a below-average schedule of offenses. And it does have some exploitable areas. And I think you hit this perfectly at the top. And it's, Logan Wilson's out again. Right, he's the quarterback of Cincinnati's defense. We saw when he left the Chargers game, defense wasn't very organized. Last week against a heavy motion and play-action team like San Francisco, there were times where Cincinnati was completely out of position, and there really isn't a linebacker on the Bengals roster that can cover, right? Like Joe Bocci and Jermaine Pratt have negative coverage grades as linebackers. It's a linebacker core that is well below average defending tight ends in both counting stats and efficiency, and it's trending even worse. Right, this should be a game where not just Fant but Alberto can find some success. Right, since he's allowed over 11 yards of reception and 6 touchdowns to the tight end position, Todd. So there are some advantages here for Denver's offense.
Should be interesting. This was a Broncos team who started out hot with 3 wins, then struggled to figure out its identity and has now since righted the ship. Like you talked about, a win here over the Bengals, moving them to 8-6, would put them in great position to try and contend for that back half of the AFC playoff picture with one of the more dynamic defenses out there. We do have one game left to go. That, of course, is the Sunday Night Football affair. But before we get there, let's get fresh perspective from behind the counter. He joins us every Thursday here on the Bet the Board podcast. You, of course, can follow John Sheeran on Twitter at JSheeran, SHEERAN1981. And John, you were like the Nostradamus for the recreational bettor out there. You said we were headed for a doomsday one of these weeks in the National Football League, and lo and behold, it was underdog Armageddon last weekend with favorites cashing at a pretty high clip. I have to imagine it was not one of the best days that you guys have seen around the FanDuel home offices.
It certainly wasn't, Todd. It was pretty much a massacre. I think it's the first time we've lost on every game on a Sunday. I know I've been saying it for weeks now that, the public were due one, and, be careful what you wish for sometimes. And I think that's what played out last Sunday. But like I said, going into the week, it's been a really profitable week for all our season for all of the books so far. And, for me, it's good to see the public get one over on us, and hopefully that continues this week.
John, can you walk through for some of our listeners what it may or may not be like? I know in the old days, and I was behind the counter at Caesars, we could have 10 winning weeks in a row, and first thing Monday morning, if we had a losing Sunday, it was somehow you guys didn't do your job, you didn't protect games, you didn't move accordingly. I imagine you guys have a little bit more carte blanche where the corporate overlords aren't coming down on your heads after one losing weekend, I hope.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And look, I'm very lucky. We have a very big brand that's used to volatility. Not just for FanDuel, but more broadly under the Flutter umbrella. And, we don't get too much heat, but, if we get another weekend like we did last week, I'm sure questions will start to come and budgets start to get reined in a little bit, because there's no doubt this season there's been, a huge amount of overperformance when it comes to hold percentage. And we've been trying to manage that expectation and message all season long. But like you said, some of the overlords, and they probably won't appreciate me calling them that, but sometimes they think that this is a structural change or a difference rather than just variance and luck on our behalf. So last weekend's a good reminder for those people as well that, a lot of luck comes into play. We do, obviously, like you guys, spend a lot of time trying to hang the right number. But after that, we kind of lay our cards down and throw them in the air, and I guess they land how they may from there.
It's always interesting to kind of create perspective because I think a lot of the newer bettors that are tuning into our Bet the Board podcast for the first time assume that professional bettors hit at an astronomical clip. We talk about it all the time, not realizing that the difference, to quote you, Payne, that you're punching a time clock and doing this for a living may be as simple as hitting 54% winners versus 51%. And when you have weekends like that, people can pound their chest that have been taking a beating. And, some of the professionals will gravitate towards the ugly ducklings, so to speak. You begin to look yourself in the mirror and you go, maybe I shouldn't have backed some of these inferior teams, even at inflated lines. And it seems to be a trend we run into in the National Football League with the haves and the have-nots through the final 3 or 4 weeks, trying to figure out who's fully engaged and which teams can just keep piling on points in crunch time when it matters most to get you to the window.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and I'm a little distracted here as I look at the screen. It seems there's some games on the move, so it's probably a good time to jump right into some of these with John. And I think one thing that was really interesting as we talked off air, but it's worth having you discuss it here with our listeners. You looked at this week and you kind of grouped games in 3 buckets. What were those buckets?
Yeah, I think this week is a really interesting scenario where we've got, like I said, 3 buckets where I think all of the games fit in one of them. The first one's a very obvious one, which is COVID, and the main teams affected so far being Cleveland, Washington, and the Rams. And I think what we've seen in society in general, and particularly in the NBA and the NFL in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen it in the Premier League in the UK as well, is that this time of season COVID's rampant. Obviously the Omicron variant is obviously causing that to be even more than it was over the last couple of months. But we're going to have to get used, I think, in the next few weeks of these big line changes around COVID. And the truth is, us trying to guess what is happening, how much exposure there is with the teams. When we hear about key players, it's obviously not just those, it's obviously the people they're close contacts with, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's these games where we really don't know where the line's going to end up, where our confidence levels are lower, and we've seen some of our competitors actually take those games off the board, which we try not to do, and hopefully do a good job of keeping a line there because I think people are interested in them. So that's very clearly the first bucket. The second bucket is, I think, where we've seen some sharp play on games that don't appear to be affected by COVID, and some of them are pretty big favourites, like Miami, for example. I think we saw very sharp money at 8.5 in that game, and that's moved out towards 10, and I think that's a pretty interesting one. The Jets look pretty pathetic right now, and I think even Miami might be able to do a bit of a job on them this weekend. And the other games are relatively quiet, where we feel there hasn't been a whole lot of movement. Games that are pretty standard from where we opened, that are pretty tight to where our numbers were. Saints Buccaneers would probably be the most high profile one of those. So those are the 3 buckets we're focusing on. We have control over a couple of them and maybe not so much on the other one.
You speak about the Saints and Buccaneers primetime Sunday night. Opened 11.5 down to 11, 10.5 some places. Where were you guys at with your number there, and kind of what's the perception that you guys have internally on the Saints at this point as they start to get a little bit healthier with Alvin Kamara returning last week?
Yeah, I obviously saw the impact of Kamara last week, and just, I think, frees up a lot of Taysom Hill as well. We were 10.1, so almost exactly 10 on the game, a total of 47. I think we're sitting 10.5 right now and 46.5 on the total, so very, very close to where our number was. Not a whole lot of professional action on that. It looks about right, but I guess we'll probably have to wait and closer to Sunday to understand if it'll move from where it is.
You did mention the COVID bucket games moving, like the Eagles that were sharp, but because of COVID, right? And you had the Browns-Raiders game moving similarly. You did mention the Dolphins being sharp just as a position on its own. Have you seen anything else sharp this week that isn't in that COVID bucket?
Yeah, I think Denver was the other one. A little bit surprising for us. We made it a 1-point favorite, the Broncos, and we saw some of our sharper customers laying 1.5 and 2, and taking them on the money line at -125 as well. So we've moved to reflect that. I think we'll probably respect it enough to come off our position, which would be to favour the Bengals. We'll probably sit around 2.5. It'd need to get to 3 before we'd start to express any opinion against that sharp move that we saw for Denver. That's probably the only high-profile one. I think the Chargers tonight was another one, but that was, my guess was that at 3.5 was understanding Jones was out and maybe expecting more to fall than just him as well. So that one's gone to 3. It doesn't look like it's going to go beyond it, though.
We always kind of talk about the Chiefs because internally you guys have had a different perception of the Chiefs than sometimes the market, and you guys have trended a little bit higher. How's your number look this week in terms of it being in line with the market?
Yeah, almost exactly this week. We've, like you said, tended to have an opinion on them almost every week for the last number of weeks. And this week it seems to have aligned. I think the COVID has probably been one element of that. We're almost a flat 3, which is where it sits right now. So happy that I don't have to sweat an opinion tonight.
And one of the games that was moving as we started recording this was Titans-Steelers. Looks like Pittsburgh's taken some money down from, about 2.5 point favorite down to as low as pick'em. And we also saw a move on the total from 40.5 out to 42.5. Anything there?
We agree with both of those moves. We made it a pick'em game. I was kind of surprised they were a 2.5 point dog, to be honest. And the total the same. We were 42, and like you said, it's kind of come up to just about where we are. So not a game we'll express an opinion on at all, but agree with the kind of 2 moves that have happened in it so far.
And the other large movement here, kind of before I kick it back, and it made some waves in the public overnight, was the firing of Urban Meyer. We saw Jacksonville open 3. Some number guys late it got to 3.5, and then this morning, based on that news of Urban Meyer being fired, we're out as high as 4.5 some places.
Yeah, we spoke about it off air, didn't we? It's a really interesting one where, with Meyer and the news that was starting to break, particularly I thought Josh Lambo's comments yesterday were pretty damning of what sort of a guy he is, and maybe the respect or lack of it from internally. Was a game where I was pretty interested in Houston. We made it a 3-point game. We had a slight lean to them. We'd probably review that again today with the understanding that, we've seen it in soccer before where coaches that are not respected get sacked and you actually see an uplift in performance. I think this is a scenario where it's hard to quantify, but I do think mentally there's something in that. And I think we'll have a brief discussion around whether or not we'll continue to have a lean from a Houston perspective, given the line movement. As you said, almost 1.5 feels like a lot for the situation. But I do think mentally you may get a more engaged Jaguar team than maybe we might have expected beforehand.
John, I get the feeling we'll know exactly where the Jaguars are if on their opening offensive series they decide to kick a field goal from 70-plus yards and Josh Lambo bangs that thing through from about 75-plus. So I think you guys are accurate in your assessment, trying to figure out the Jags can't get worse than what we saw last week against the Titans. So we'll see if they show a little bit more fight this week, especially install as a favorite. The last game, John, I wanted to pick your brain on real quickly, and it's one we didn't have a chance to cover on the podcast, mainly because of some of the uncertainty surrounding one of the starting quarterbacks. When you look at the Green Bay Packers kind of hovering in that no man's land price range in that 5.5 spot, you guys had Green Bay listed as a 2.5 point road favorite on the look ahead numbers. Suffice to say that this is kind of, hey, we're going to wait and see if our bettors push us one way or another regarding the status of Lamar Jackson and Coach Harbaugh's relatively ambiguous comments all week long about his status.
Look, a couple of comments I would make. One is not really waiting on bettors at all, kind of more trying to evaluate what is likely to happen. As you said, Harbaugh seemed to indicate there's a decent chance Lamar can play. I'm not entirely sure we believe him. And we're kind of just sitting halfway. We have this as one of the biggest differential in values from a points perspective. Almost 6.5 points, I think, of a differential between Lamar playing and not. And if you think about 2.5 to where we sit now at 5 or 5.5, we clearly have only gone kind of halfway between those numbers. Expected to be very, very close to a touchdown if he doesn't play. And I think I'm of the belief that I don't think he will play. So I think there's probably decent sentiment and value maybe in betting and laying the number now with a view to maybe having some buyback closer to kickoff, maybe even beyond a touchdown. You find yourself in a really good position.
It's always fascinating to watch some of the cat and mouse that goes on, especially with some of the marquee players and the impact they can have on the number. One final question I have for you, John, not related to any NFL games this weekend or what transpired. You had a chance to go to a bucket list football game last Saturday that both Payne and I have never been to, that we've talked about at great lengths. Can you kind of describe that experience of seeing Army-Navy live to some of our listeners who haven't had a chance to take that in?
Yeah, I forgot about that actually, in terms of, I didn't think you were going to mention it. Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, it was one of the best experiences of any sporting event I've been to. The pageantry beforehand, having the two cadets, areas in the field, I think sections in the field were amazing to kind of view. And the game itself, I'm lucky enough, I have a couple of colleagues and ex-colleagues who are West Point graduates and managed to take the game in with them. And just to see them sweat it as much as they did when it became obvious that Navy were going to get the win was an interesting viewing experience, but couldn't recommend it highly enough. Really, privileged to be there and to take it in. It was always on my bucket list. I didn't actually think it was something I'd ever get to, and the cards just managed to fall right and have it in the MetLife on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. Just an incredible experience. Couldn't recommend it highly enough.
One of my closest friends from college actually flew out to the East Coast. His father-in-law, he was a serviceman, so he went to MetLife both Saturday and Sunday, watched Army's offensive display on Saturday, followed that up with the Jets on Sunday. I kind of gave him a hard time. I said, you may never be allowed back in that building knowing how few points your two teams put up combined. Just when you think Army's option couldn't get things going, you get to watch Zach Wilson bounce passes all over against that Saints defense. So a little rough weekend for that fine gentleman. But John, can't thank you enough for all your contributions each and every week throughout the season. I know Payne and I will be rooting for you, even if some of our listeners may not be, this coming weekend as far as the NFL action is concerned.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
It's incredible, Payne. You and I have talked about going to Army Navy for years. John beats us there, and he hasn't even been in the States for all that long.
Yeah, tough to travel during football season, but that's on the bucket list. I think we've been talking about it for 7 years and done nothing about it.
Yeah, well, eventually we'll get there. That, the Kentucky Derby, a laundry list of other sporting events that we've put on the calendar. I don't think we've been anywhere close to even booking a hotel room or a trip. So somewhere along the way, it's shit or get off the pot for both of us. We'll make it happen. But it's always funny when you talk to a bookmaker who has to endure a week where the public has their say in what goes on. But no doubt it came in the wake of what has been a profitable season. So John, to his credit, as he does each and every week, takes it like a champ, win or lose for the house.
Yeah, he's great with that. And I think, we're all cognizant that, if only books won and only professional bettors won, there would not actually be a market for us to bet into, right? There wouldn't be a sports book. Eventually, right, people wake up, and even if they are on the somewhat degenerate side, right, after like the 10th time you're depositing in your account, it's probably a sign that you shouldn't be doing this. So at some point, like, guys like that the recreational bettors have to win, right? That's the way they come back. That's the way money enters the market and allows books to operate and professional bettors to have a market to actually bet into.
For a lot of folks, it is the cost of entertainment, much like the money they'll spend on greens fees and such going to the golf course. So there is no doubt about it that there are those weeks that get you coming back, those 6 to 8 team parlays that keep you thinking it can happen. If it happened once, it can definitely happen again. Before we do get to the Saints and Bucks game, did want to get your quick take. I know we kind of teased it in the middle of the show, talking about Urban Meyer and the Jacksonville Jaguars. This just had to be a formality, and you think given the recent events you heard with Josh Lambo that came out, that Shad Khan didn't want to wait around any longer and give Urban either a chance to save his job with a win streak to close things out or have players continue to rebel against what's been going on inside that locker room.
I mean, I think we all saw this situation really, truly unfolding the last few weeks, that the locker room was lost. We had seen bits and pieces of that throughout the course of the season. And I think ultimately when Shad Khan is looking at Urban Meyer's contract, he's saying to himself, probably going to have to keep him around for another year. But then when there's a situation like this, there's now cause. And that might allow him to get out of some of the financial burden of this firing. And so it makes complete sense at that point. But we've been, I would say, naysayers from the very onset about the hiring of Urban Meyer. We've been on record saying we thought Ryan Day was at least better schematically in times where Urban Meyer would miss a game or two. And we thought offensively, Ryan Day was a little bit more vertical and a little bit more ahead of the times than Urban Meyer. And you start to think about Urban Meyer's success over the years, and it's like, no doubt, it's, you built a program at Bowling Green and you were able to land 3-star recruits there while everyone else was in your conference was recruiting, 1- and 2-star kids or kids that didn't even have a rating. And then you go to Florida and, it's a ton of 5-star kids, and just the talent was better, but the offense was never overly sophisticated. And now all of a sudden, and it's easier to say a little bit after the fact, we weren't sure why this was happening in the moment, but you and I would text each other back and forth every time Urban Meyer had a new staff hiring in Jacksonville. And we just thought that there was going to be this dynamic staff put together. And then all of a sudden it's like, Charlie Strong, Darrell Bevell. It's like the most bizarre group of assistants being hired, right? Like Brian Schottenheimer. It was just bizarre to me. It's like he didn't have guys set up for this move to the NFL. It wasn't a thought in his mind that, hey, if this happens one day, because I am willing to take this job, I'm going to have the staff ready and in mind. But it tells me that a lot of people within the space, and this is how things happen, right? People in the industry know far more than the people outside. But it tells me that when you look at this staff of Brian Schottenheimer and Darrell Bevell and Charlie Strong, those are the only guys that he could get to come on board. And it's probably because most people knew that he was a little bit of a mess. And again, it's easier to say now after the fact that this is why the staff was put together. But even in the moment, you and I were like, geez, this is just kind of a weird group of coaches to be hiring here.
I know you're extremely excited to watch Darrell Bevell's offense on Saturday or Sunday operate against the Houston Texans in a game where Jacksonville took some money early in the week, now up as high as 5.5 at some shops throughout the market. I'm curious to see where there's a little bit of buyback for the Houston Texans, despite the temporary bump that Jacksonville may get playing without their head coach. But a game that's actually meaningful as far as the standings are concerned, the Sunday Nighter. For the second week in a row, we have a double-digit home favorite. This time it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the divisional rival in the New Orleans Saints. Tampa, an 11-point chalk. Total in the game, 46.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. The Saints have now won 9 of 11, including a matchup earlier this year where the Saints won outright as a 4-point home underdog. The Saints exploded for their most points in a game last Sunday versus the Jets since the early season meeting against Tampa Bay. Meanwhile, Tom Brady continues to rewrite the record book. His 10 wins now marks the 19th time in Brady's career he's accomplished the feat. He leads in wins, completions, passing yards, touchdowns. His touchdown to Brashad Perriman in overtime against Buffalo was the 89th player to catch a touchdown from Tom. Unfortunately, buddy, you and I are not on that list. The Saints, they were great as an underdog, but they failed in recent times. When you look at New Orleans, if they're trying to devise a game plan to attack this Tampa Bay defense, do they even have the playmakers other than Alvin Kamara to put a little bit of fear into Todd Bowles' scheme?
Sean Payton certainly has his work cut out for him, right? And we know he's great designing and calling plays and manufacturing offense. And obviously Alvin Kamara returning last week was massive, although I thought he was going to wear him out in the first game. But I've asked multiple people this question, and you kind of hinted at, like, does he have the talent or the parts to attack the Buccaneers the way you want to attack them? But, Todd, is it videos or pictures? Which one is it?
I like videos.
Okay. What does Taysom Hill have on Sean Payton? There is not a player in NFL history that has earned the money Taysom Hill has for his level of production. And sure, like, we have seen middling players.
How dare you talk?
Positions.
How dare you talk so disparagingly about the Great White Hope? As we got to see the pride and joy of BYU's last two great quarterbacks put on quite the clinic last week in MetLife Stadium.
This is true. And, like, there's been this stretch where, occasionally, right, like a middling player at a position of need, a premium position, has like a monster season, and he'll ink like a $25 to $35 million deal over 3 or 4 years. Taysom Hill, when it's all said and done, might come close to making $100 million in this league, and he's done it as a gadget guy playing minimal snaps, or he's done it as an undeserving quarterback who has more interceptions than touchdown passes. Even in the last 2 starts, if you only factor in the first 3 quarters before, like, the blowouts ensue, Taysom Hill's 26 out of 34 quarterbacks in EPA plus completion percentage above expectation. I just don't get it. And, what makes this specific matchup really difficult is, the way you want to attack Tampa Bay isn't the way the Saints are comfortable playing right now, nor do they have the pieces to kind of do that. And, like Taysom Hill, first 3 quarters against Dallas, put up a 34% passing success rate. And then against a Jets secondary that's dead last, 32nd in defensive pass efficiency, the Saints go 65% run the first 3 quarters in a neutral situation game. Taysom Hill was bad throwing early against a bad Jets secondary. Clearly, the finger was still bugging him. There was this situation on an early drive where Taysom goes back to throw the ball and it just slips out of his grip. Right? Now you have the number 1 run defense in Tampa the first 3 quarters with revenge after New Orleans won the earlier meeting this season. Are the Saints going to be able to do enough through the air to attack the weakness? And I'm not sure they can, right? And then you think, hey, maybe we're going to devise an opening script and package where it's going to be a lot of designed quarterback runs with Taysom Hill. Okay. How long before that gets sniffed out? And then you start to look at the matchup. It's like the Bucs did play another offense in the Eagles with a mobile quarterback that's really a part of the run game. The Eagles had 7 points the first 43 minutes. Jalen Hurts ran 10 times for 44 yards. Most of the EPA damage came well after the game was over, and Tampa was up 3 scores. Right now, I know Hurts, I believe, had 2 rushing touchdowns in that game, so the EPA again looks like it's through the roof. But in the first half, Hurts had a 17% rushing success rate on 6 carries. He was able to break an explosive run, but the 6 carries went for 20 yards in the first half. If that's what you're basing your offense on, Taysom Hill running, 1, is he going to survive the game? 2, doesn't matter, right? Trevor Siemian's probably a better thrower and probably a better quarterback for this matchup. But maybe that's the route they go. It's like, hey, give us all you got to start this game. It's like the Drago. If he dies, he dies. But anyways, you're looking at Tampa's defense. Maybe this is the saving grace, right? They played 5 quarters in humidity last week. The defense was on the field for 76 snaps. Tom Brady said it was the most important game of the season last week. Maybe there's an element of fatigue if you can have enough success on the ground. And that's kind of the thing here. Early on, if Dennis Allen's defense is able to kind of, keep Tampa at bay here, then you can kind of play this grinder offensively. But there certainly isn't anything on paper within this matchup or anything that Taysom Hill's done under quarterback in his entire NFL history that would suggest they're going to have great success here against Tampa Bay's defense.
Well, speaking of Dennis Allen, he's devised great game plans in the past. When you look at Tom Brady, he's thrown 25 interceptions since joining the Buccaneers franchise at the beginning of last year. More than 25% of those picks have come against the Saints, and the playoff game notwithstanding, the Saints have really had his number and confused him defensively. Are there things that New Orleans does that Tampa hasn't picked up on? Because Tom normally is great diagnosing things pre-snap, and we've talked at great lengths about this Saints secondary being a little bit more of a paper tiger than we anticipated coming into the season.
So this is pretty interesting to me. I've dug really deep into this game, and in the first matchup back in Week 8, we mentioned Dennis Allen, right? How he'd given Tom Brady and Tampa some issues in the last handful of meetings, and some of it was, all the parts being new for Tampa in Tom's first season, right? They played each other in the very first game of the season for 2020. But what's interesting to me is 1 out of the 4 meetings between Brady's Bucs and Dennis Allen isn't like the others. So if you go back to that very first game, the very first meeting in 2020, Tom's first game in Tampa, Bucs were held to 4.8 yards per play. Brady had a 46% passing success rate. Massive win for Dennis Allen defensively. In the second game, the Bucs were held to 4.2 yards per play and a 33% success rate. In the third meeting of the season, which came, I believe, in the divisional round playoff game, Tampa won, but they were held to 4.6 yards per play, and Brady had a 47% success rate through the air. Then the fourth meeting was this year, back in Week 8. The Saints defense came into that game on fire, red hot. The Saints defense was 4th in EPA per play allowed the first 7 weeks, 3rd in defensive efficiency. But there was this stretch over the first 7 weeks where New Orleans played Sam Darnold and Mac Jones in his 3rd start, and Daniel Jones and Taylor Heineke and Geno Smith. So there were some question marks to, was the defense as legit as some of the metrics indicated? Week 8 comes, and New Orleans wins 37-28. Everything looks great, right? Dennis Allen did it again. There was a difference, though. Tampa Bay averaged 7.3 yards per play had a 50% success rate, had 8 explosives. They did it with Gronk only playing 6 snaps. He's obviously fully healthy right now. Tampa Bay lost because they were -3 in turnover differential. The Saints had a defensive score, another touchdown that only needed to go 35 yards. Tampa was penalized 11 times to boot in that game. So it was a very fortunate win in my mind for the Saints, and we started to see Tom Brady with, an offense that now has full-blown chemistry, right? It's not the very first game all these guys have played together in a COVID-shortened season, right? It's like now year 2, we're all like familiar with each other. We all know what we want to run. Offensive coordinator and quarterback are on the same page. It's just vastly different, and suddenly we saw the Bucs surge a little bit metrically. So, what makes me nervous if I were thinking of taking the points with New Orleans here is that Tampa's offense, figured Dennis Allen's defense out just a little bit. And the difference also here is the Saints come into this game trending dramatically different than when they played the first time in Week 8, right? That's when the Saints were a top 5 defense heading into the first meeting. But now all of a sudden you look from weeks 9 to 13, the Saints are 21st in EPA per play allowed, 27th in EPA per pass allowed. Maybe manhandling the Jets offense, which is bottom 5 in the NFL without its 2 top pass catching options, brings some confidence back. Cam Jordan returning would obviously be huge. He sent out a cryptic social media post, which would indicate he'll come off the Big C list and play. Chauncey Gardner returned to practice in a limited fashion on Wednesday. Let's monitor that situation. He is the Saints' slot corner, and that area of the pass defense has not been as good with him out. I came into this game thinking like, right, there could be some value on New Orleans here. Number looked a touch high. New Orleans obviously needs the game more than Tampa, although Tampa isn't throwing it away, right? They're fighting for a number 1 seed and a bye. But then I looked at our numbers, and I was like, nope. Right, like made Tampa -9.3 on a neutral, give the Buccaneers a 1.5 for home field. And then I left my handicapping thinking like, boy, like Sean Payton's going to have to be a miracle worker on offense. Hope there's fatigue from the Bucs defense. And then somehow Dennis Allen finds the magic dust and the Saints defense returns to their early season form. But everything I just mentioned has to happen in conjunction here for the Saints to cover. Now, I have seen a little Saints money come in, right? Open like 11.5. We're now down to 10.5. That's kind of where I'm at, right? 9.3, add another like 1.5 there. Puts me at like, what's the monkey math on that? 10.8. We just talked to John. He's at like 10.1. Like, there's not a ton of value here in this number, but I envision going into this, looking at the number, it's like, oh, there's going to be some value on the Saints. And it just wasn't the case.
It's 2 interesting teams. I mean, New Orleans has had to go through quite a bit. I mean, they were able to end that long losing streak, to your point, against a much beleaguered Jets team. So I'm not sure what you can really take away from it. We'll see what they can.
7-point game heading to the 4th.
Yeah, it was, and it never even felt that close with Zach Wilson struggling mightily to do much of anything on the offensive side. 10-6, I think, at the half or thereabouts. And we'll see what we get from Tampa in the wake of taking their foot off the gas against Buffalo, letting the Bills back into it. I'm not sure against a divisional foe if they're able to build a 2-score lead and make New Orleans one-dimensional. The Saints are a team that you have a lot of hope and optimism that they can come crashing in through the back door. So for the second straight week, Sunday Night Football showcases a game where we're going to have a double-digit spread. And you know what? We could be headed towards a trio of Sunday Night Football games with the Cowboys against the Washington football team on deck next Sunday. 5 games broken down as eloquently as we possibly can. I want to thank John Sheeran for his contributions each and every week on this very show. And since I've been remiss in telling people that they can follow you on Twitter, Payne at Payne Insider, I'm Todd Furman, and the podcast at Bet the Board Pod, figured it was a great time for that. Also want to remind our loyal listeners, FanDuel.com/BetTheBoard. Use the promo code BetTheBoard. Take advantage of all the great new user sign-up bonuses, especially in states where FanDuel is available and accessible for you. Perfect for the holidays and all of the bowl games that inevitably our listeners will plan to bet on top of the NFL action this weekend. But one final order of business, and that's identifying where we have an investable opportunity on the NFL Week 15 slate.
It's a difficult slate to navigate, and I think John depicted that pretty succinctly with the buckets of games, right? Like there's just a lot of, you got a couple games off the board still. You got a couple games that have moved a bunch because of the Big C, and there's really only a couple games that are kind of normal. And I know a lot of people won't love this because the idea of, Belichick catching points off the bye probably scares some people. But the one game that we have played to this point that is still at the current number is the Colts money line. We laid about $1.25. Now, it's stayed there because I think we're going to see this standalone game catch a lot of public attention, right? And people are going to gravitate towards the Patriots as a recreational bettor when you can get Belichick again off the bye at plus money, right? That's going to probably impact that line a little bit. We broke this game down above probably for about 15 minutes, so go back and give that a listen. But I do think there's an ability here, now that the Colts defense is a little bit healthier, to make Mac Jones throw it. You had Kahari Willis return in the Colts secondary, which should improve that unit a little bit. We know Xavier Rhodes was dealing with a calf injury. The bye week did him some wonders. So I think you're looking at a Colts defense that is probably the healthiest it's been since the early part of the season. We believe the Patriots defense is vastly overrated based upon the schedule of offenses and quarterbacks it's faced. And then when they've stepped up in class, they've been helped by weather. And so I think the Colts are going to have an aggressive game plan here and be able to really move the ball offensively. So let's go ahead and lay it with the Colts on the money line. Again, we got minus 125. We're still kind of in that range, like you're saying, minus 127 at Pinnacle. So we're in that range. Now, if you want to wait a little bit, just because I think there's going to be some public sentiment towards the Patriots, that might work too. But ultimately, let's go with the Colts. Is that one you endorse?
Yeah. I mean, I endorse everything that we play around these parts. I mean, you know this being the case. I did take some actually +1 myself as well on the look-ahead number there with the Colts. Was surprised to see the number move as far as it did, but added to my position, much like you, in that $1.25 range. And I'm seeing 130 more or less painted absolutely everywhere right now. So want our listeners to be able to get the best of the number. I know folks scrambled last week. Cam Newton didn't do us any favors. We should have been able to cash at all prices at 21 shaded under, or a variety of where we were there last week. But there's no doubt, I think when you talk to a lot of the folks in the space and what we've seen with our own eyes, the Colts may be one of the most undervalued commodities, not just in the AFC, but the entire league as a whole. Let's hope, to your point, we get Frank Reich thinking outside the box, being more dynamic, and knowing that the Patriots are going to key in on Jonathan Taylor, as they often do, to force you to play left-handed. Could be a big game, hopefully, for Michael Pittman, T.Y. Hilton, and a couple of the other pass catchers for the Colts against that Patriots secondary.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what is interesting, right, is that the guys that probably shouldn't tip their hand a week prior did, right, taking the Colts +1. And because of the Patriots' recent form and their perception, books opened this pick, and we quickly saw this push out to 2.5. And one book went to 3, and immediately, right, you had some price grabbers saying, hey, like, the Patriots shouldn't be +3. And I guess, from a price perspective, that's obvious. We did see a battle very similar to this last week where no one thought the Browns should be the favorite based upon their numbers, and we saw some of the price grabbers take Baltimore +3, and ultimately, like Pinnacle, I believe, closed that game 3 - 17, so it was clear-cut the right side taking the information side, which was Cleveland, and not the numbers side. Baltimore, although Baltimore does kind of sneak their way in the back door, I took a Herculean effort, right? I don't think anybody thought down 24-3 with Tyler Huntley that was going to be the case, but it ultimately fell that way. And we saw both sides of the coin win, right? The sharp guys who laid the money line with the Browns won, and the number grabbers who took the Ravens +3 got in the back door there. But I don't know with the standalone element here if this is going to be a game to get the 3. I initially thought it would. We'll see. But yeah, let's roll with the Colts money line here, and yeah, it's about -130. There's some -128 out there. Shop around. I do think there is potential, though. You're going to have, just in a standalone spot, right, Saturday night, you might have a little bit of that Super Bowl element, Todd, where the money line gets a little out of whack on the dog and the favorite, because the public's going to come in and be like, hey, do I want to take 2 or 2.5 here, or I'll just take Belichick +120? And so that might cause a Super Bowl effect here a little bit in this standalone spot Saturday night with a better price on the Colts money line versus laying the points.
Very good point. And we've seen the importance of 1 and 2 play a much bigger role in the betting markets as far as the NFL is concerned over the last couple of years than if we were doing this podcast 4 or 5 years ago. And you would have said, you know what, may not be worth laying the $1.30 if you have a chance to lay 2 in the game, given the infrequency of that number falling. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Payne, any final words of wisdom before we take a little 24-hour break and we reconvene tomorrow for a little Bet the Board pregame show?
That's it. Bet the Board pregame show Friday, noon Eastern on our YouTube page, YouTube/Bet the Board. Christmas is near. We will probably do a nice little giveaway. So tune into that and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can win the prize.
Yep, and for those folks wondering what the holiday recording schedule will look like, since I know a number of you have asked about bowl games, we'll hit on some of the biggest bowl games, but with all the player opt-outs and everything else, I know a lot of folks are trying to produce content around some of those secondary and tertiary games. We're not going to commit our energy and resources to trying to do that, knowing that the information could be obsolete by the time that we post the podcast. So we'll hit on the biggest games. If we see an investable opportunity, as always, we'll pass that along. And for any updates to the recording and release of podcast schedules, again, be sure to follow Bet the Board Pod on Twitter. All right, folks, best of luck this weekend, and come Saturday night under the lights at Lucas Oil Stadium with a Colts ticket in hand. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.